we learned an awful lot of lessons, and one of the ones we learned is there's not information out there for event managers. We're unique in California in that we have a horse show drug testing program. It's called our Equine Medication Monitoring Program, where all of our events, non-rodeo, non-team penning, ranch sorting, those sort of things aren't registered with us. But horse shows, hunter jumper shows, 4-H shows are registered through the department. It is an industry program that they support and fund the drug testing program. So we had the opportunity to talk to quite a few event managers during this time because they're normally calling us. So they were calling us for guidance this time. And they're like, what do you have for biosecurity? What should we cancel events? Should we not cancel events? Well, at this time, we looked everywhere. We didn't know of anything. And we had about 92 events that were registered with us that canceled between May 13th and June 30th. Our industry looked to us as what can we do? How can we make this better in the future? I have an advisory committee to that EMMP, or Equine Medication Monitoring Program. There's 17 members of the industry. So I have somebody from the hunter jumpers, from the dressage, from the cutting, and they came to us and said, we really need to do something. We need to get education out there so that we're not having all these canceled events. These canceled events weren't just cuttings. I had everything from hunter jumper shows in Southern California to, I did have some rodeos that called me and canceled because they weren't sure what to do. So again, we have every industry that has been impacted looking to us for some guidance. So I said, okay, well, let's see what's out there. So the only things that I could find were in Australia and New Zealand that are specific to the equine event managers. There is materials out there for farms, biosecurity on farms, biosecurity at boarding facilities, where we have a UC Davis document for biosecurity at racetracks, but there really wasn't anything for event managers to say, what do I do? What are the biosecurity practices that I should implement at my event? What should I do to determine whether my event goes on or whether I have some risk factors? We looked at a NOM study from 2005 that actually talked to event managers looking at some of the risk factors. And we looked at it from the perspective of, okay, there's some things, they don't require health certificates, the majority of them. That's what the NOM study was showing. They don't have, proper biosecurity procedures in place. So we have a lot of gaps. So the industry said to me, okay, you're going to develop a toolkit. Silly little me said, yeah, sure, okay, I'll do this. Didn't know what I was getting into at the time. So one of the things I had to do is, what are their needs really? What specific concerns or issues are out there? So what I did is I visited 10 California facilities that hold events across the state to look at the stabling issues, the animal movement issues. Jerry referred to the horses at Bakersfield that left. Yeah, 200 horses within an hour going every which direction. Yet when we asked them for what the addresses were, we got mailing labels because they didn't have an electronic list of where these horses were going back to. It was just mailing labels. At that time, that's what they could get quickly to us. And that took a couple days to figure out what we were going to do with that and how we were going to contact. So animal movement became one of the issues we wanted to look at. How do we know who's there, who's coming, who's going? And what are some of the current biosecurity practices? Well, this was kind of an eye-opening event. So we first had to look at what are our stable challenges. And if you look here, we have some wooden surfaces that are pretty rough and corrugated and not really easy to clean. So that becomes a challenge that we need to address. Then we have some smoother surfaces. Then we have the metal stalls. And we also had these canvas stalls. And we had everything across the border. When we talked about stabling, we had everything from, wooden to these canvas stalls to the aluminum stalls. So there wasn't going to be a one-size-fits-all document, I learned very quickly. Then the next thing we were looking at is how are animals monitored? Very few of the facilities actually had gates, lock gates, stabling areas that they could actually have for isolated animals. Very, very few had isolation areas. Some of them said, oh yeah, we'll just use this little stall over here. Okay, well, you're in the middle of the show stables. That's probably not a good isolation area. Very few actually tracked animals on and in and out of those stabling areas. So again, not a one-size-fits-all document was going to be able to address all of these concerns. And then we have the commingling of horses. So I love this picture because this was several events that I went to, and I see them all tied up. Now, these horses don't come from the same stabling area. They don't even come from the same geographic area when I actually looked into it more detailed. But they're all tied, waiting to go into the ring. Then you have the wash areas where horses can go, nose to nose, and some of these horses were from the same stable, some of them weren't. So commingling horses at these events, we know it happens, but really, where are the common areas that you can address in a biosecurity plan? Communal water troughs. These are always interesting. Although we know that that is a risk, some industries, some parts of the show industry, some parts of the equine industry don't see it as a risk because their cattle drink from the same thing. So really, how are we going to get these show events, equine events, to stop using communal water troughs? I will say we actually are seeing more of the events telling people that they're not going to use them, actually dumping all the communal water troughs. So we're going in the right direction. Will we get all events to do that? Probably not. This became one of my pet peeves as I went through, is where people actually stored their feed and how they secured it. Now, this is a pile, and if you can see here, we have some birds, we have some manure barrels here, we have the manure pitchfork, we have their trash. Everything under the sun was just thrown in one big pile. Yeah, it is sunny California, we can leave all this stuff outside, but again, what are we having access to from a disease standpoint? This next one really, the picture really doesn't do it justice, because you can see the manure pile here and the hay pile here, and right behind it is some grain. Well, the fact is these people were being a little on the lazy side because they only had to walk 10 feet to dump it into an actual manure pile. Instead, they went to the end of the barn and that was it, and they put it right next to their hay. So again, we have some disease issues and control issues there. This one's even better. So we stack our hay and then we let this horse eat from it. And then we let the next horse eat from it. So again, we're potentially transmitting disease. And again, hay being stored next to wheelbarrows, concern for cross-contamination issues. Shared equipment. Again, can an event manager stop this? Should this even be considered in a biosecurity toolkit for event managers or event organizations? Well, they can set precedents and put recommendations to their equine exhibitors on what to do. Not piling all the bridles and not piling all the bridles in each, outside the show ring or outside the stall. And we all know that those cross ties, those horses love to chew on those. So if you have a disease, you're spreading disease from one horse to another. You're not going to stop the horse from chewing on it, so what are you going to do to prevent that? What biosecurity measures can you do to make sure we're minimizing the disease risk? So as I went through all of these facilities, we were looking at what should we be telling people, what should be our targets. The other thing is the water hoses. And in the wash racks, they're left around everywhere. They could be placed in the manure bucket. So again, contamination of the water hoses. And then when you go to water horses, you dunk it from one bucket to the next bucket to the next bucket, just traveling along disease. So again, what practices can we tell event managers to help to eliminate this? I know when I did a disease investigation for one of the latest herpes outbreaks, I went in and I told them, okay, you really want to get rid of this disease, you got to get rid of your cross ties and get rid of your hoses. And I had one of the owners look at me and go, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to water the horses if we get rid of the hoses? I go, a bucket? Oh, that's going to be an awful lot of work. I said, well, you can use your hose, but that's how you can transmit disease. So it's just trying to see what will work, what's going to be feasible. Not everything's feasible. Some people are just going to assume the risk. And that's one of the points we needed to get across. Dogs at an equine event. This little corgi was hilarious. I literally followed this dog around this event grounds, and it was about 15 minutes later before it finally came to its owner. And the owner's like, oh, I thought you were in the barn. Nope. He had walked through everyone else's barn. He had walked over to drink some water out of a little water bucket. It actually went and was cozy with another horse and then another dog. So again, watching these dogs, and I snapped this picture a little late. This dog actually went up and sniffed the horses, and it was nose to nose, and I was a little late. I'm not the best photographer. But it goes to show that dogs are in there, they're carrying things, they can carry things on their coat, they can carry it on their paws. How do we address this at a horse show? Because everyone knows that horse show people love bringing their dogs with them. So what do we do? How do we control this? What risk are they willing to take? This is the age-old, I took somebody with me on one of these, I took a poultry vet with me on one of these inspections, and we went out to a showgrounds, and he goes, that rag, they're just using it on everybody. Don't they understand? I'm like, no, they don't understand. Let's get them all pretty before the show, but let's do everybody. So again, if you have one horse sick in the barn, this is a great way to get another horse sick in the barn. And I grew up at the racetrack, so trying to tell my dad that each horse has to have its own snot rag is like, forget it. It's not going to happen. Okay, it's not going to happen, but understand your risk. So there is risk when we use these communal rags. So after all of that, I went to the industry advisory committee and I said, okay, I'm going to develop a basic biosecurity toolkit. They go, well, what about if a disease happens? I'm like, well, then you need to put in an infectious disease control plan. Well, we want one of them too. And I'm like, no, you only want a basic biosecurity for equine events. That's what we started with. Really? That's really what we're going to do. Oh, no, we're going to do it all. I said, okay, let's see how this works. So we ended up saying, okay, here's what you should do on a daily basis. Here's some recommendations. Again, the document that we were targeting is not putting any regulations, not putting any standards in place, trying to work with the industry to give them the information. So we started with our basic biosecurity. Then we went into, okay, you have a disease outbreak or a suspicious disease. How do you handle that? We'll give you some enhanced biosecurity measures. Then we'll give you some infectious disease control plan that you can work with your veterinarian on site to address these concerns. And part 3 actually is what everyone calls the actual toolkit. It's actually the tools that they can use for this. So I'm going to go through and just give you some of the highlights. So one of the things we got asked is, some people are saying, well, we need to explain to event managers, industry organizations, why we need this biosecurity, why it's important. So we talked about the perfect storm, using Ogden as a typical example, talking about the biosecurity challenges at equine events. So the stabling, how closely they're stabled. So when we look at stabling, we're looking at ventilation, if it's an indoor arena or indoor areas. We looked at commingling of all these horses from unknown sources from various geographic areas. So that's a challenge. And moving them within these areas and limited monitoring of that movement. So those are all challenges we talked about at these for these biosecurity measures and why, kind of the why to do it. So the assessments that we built, that we talked about, hits the key points. So how does an event manager, and this is the question we got from our cutting industry, was, well, how do I know if the facility is going to be enough or adequate, or what issues are associated with the facility? So we went with the red light, green light approach. So there's a checklist of all of the biosecurity measures or risk assessments for the facility. And they can say, do I have a high risk, which would be red, or do I have a very low risk, which would be green, or do I have something in the middle, which would be yellow? So we did that for the facility. We talked about animal entry requirements. Should they require a health certificate? What grounds should they consider? Meaning, if there's a disease outbreak, should they put additional measures? Should they have a no fever policy? That sort of assessment of what are their needs? What are their needs as far as stabling? Do they have enough stalls? Do they have an adequate isolation area? You need to look at that before you decide to have an event there. If you have to get smaller stalls to cram more horses in, that becomes a disease risk. So we talk about what is the policy for assessing the stalls when you go in. Have they been cleaned prior to you going in? Where do the hay, the manure, where does all that go? Where does the water get disposed? How does it get disposed? What is the ability for horse-to-horse contact or horse to other species contacts? How do you assess the traffic and the record keeping? So this is all in an assessment form so they can say, check, 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 this is where I am. So then we went into, now they know what their risks are based on the assessment. So then we take it the next step. So you have your risks. Now we're going to give you recommendations for those risks. And we talk about, your entry requirements. Only healthy horses onto the property. Do you have a no fever policy? Well, if you put a no fever policy in there, you better have a response for that fevered horse. Meaning, okay, now we have a suspicion because we have a fevered horse or febrile horse. How do we isolate it? Where's it going to go? Is isolation set up? How are we going to monitor those temperatures? How are we going to have handling all of the horses in and out of that area? What is going to be our policy on equipment handling? How can we, now we know there's horse-to-horse contact, how can we limit that? What are some ways that we can limit actual contact with those horses? How do we limit indirect contacts? One of the things we look at is bit inspections. Some of these facilities have, organizations require a bit inspection and people actually touching each horse's mouth. So again, that's an ability for disease transmission. So we looked at, well, let the owner do it or let the groom do it for that horse. Don't let anybody actually touch it, or wear gloves. So we talked about that. We talk a little bit about human to horse contact, your visitor policy. Are you going to let visitors in everywhere? Where are your dogs going to go? What type of vector control program? Because again, we try to be inclusive of diseases, so we're talking about any animals that could be bringing in disease or any vectors such as West Nile and the such. So like, how do we drain standing water, addressing those issues around the wash racks. We talk about tracking movement, making sure everyone knows what's going on, so posting signage. Medical device use and disposal, so that we talk a little bit about contaminated needles, especially with pyroplasmosis, and addressing that issue. A cleaning and disinfection protocol, and most importantly, probably communicating the biosecurity plan. It's no good to have it if no one knows about it and no one does it. So then we went into part 2. We talked a little bit more in depth of, that you have a disease, you have a suspicion of a disease, you have some clinical signs, you need to enhance your biosecurity and put in some more stringent infectious disease control measures. So that's where you would stop movement. So they need to think about this ahead of time. How are you going to stop movement? You're not going to have the 200 horses that are Bakersfield, all of a sudden somebody goes down, neurologic horse, gets euthanized, and everyone leaves. Well, you need to know where those horses are going, how to know where those horses are going, what advice do you give to those people. So again, looking through how are we going to monitor what's going on. Do you really need to cancel an event? That's the other thing. Can you just isolate the horse until you have a diagnosis and continue with your show? So we talk a really great deal about isolation, isolating these sick horses, but what do you do with the ones that are immediately exposed? So we talk through this with the event managers in that description of what is the risk, who are the at risk, who are the high risk, who are the medium risk, and who are the low risk. And then we handle each of those categories as far as when we want to release them from the property, what are the recommendations we give them, the isolation at home, the monitoring of the clinical signs at home. We also encourage on all of this is working with the veterinarians of the area when they develop this infectious disease control plan. We also encourage them to work with the animal health officials or public health officials if it's a rabies suspect to know, kind of what they need to do. One of the key points of this document, and the reason I'm here today, is so we can make sure that everyone gets this and we're getting the same message out and information out. But this document, we made it so that California's information can just be lifted out. It's all in text boxes. So we have the California Animal Health Officials information. We have the our laboratories information. We have our public health information, all in text boxes. So this information can go to you as a state or industry group, and you guys can, as Dudley wants to do, put American Horse Council all over it. But that's fine. That's what we're intending to do because we really want to protect the industry and get this out there so that everyone has this information and so that they have all of the tools in the toolkit. So we'll get to the tools because that's actually really what's the most important from the event manager's standpoint. That's what they keep telling me. So there's risk assessments, there's the checklist. We give them a pictorial of this is good, this is bad, this is what you want to do, this is how you fix this. We give them actual logs for temperature, participation declarations that they can hand to people when they enter. We give them posters that we've made up on for exhibitors for tips to keeping your horse healthy and a brochure. We did incorporate some of the CDC documents on hand sanitation. We talked about disease control measures and what is the proper disinfectants. So this is really what they're going to use. And we have one event manager that manages 27 events in California and some pretty large hunter jumper shows that I worked with her on all of this, and she is implementing these tools in the toolkit so that we can go forward and make sure that we are protecting the horse industry. So in addition, we have all of the isolation protocols, exhibitor handouts, stop movement signs, Cleaning and disinfection for a horse trailer, actual guidance. I know some of it sounds simple, but actually I'm getting asked, what do you recommend? What disinfectants do you recommend? How do you recommend we do this? So this is giving them the actual things to do. And the most important thing that I got from the event managers is they like this checklist of responsibilities. It kind of lists out everything that should be included in the infectious disease control plan, and then they can assign it to people. And then they have that plan in place. And so it's like a checklist template for them. And obviously we have communication is key, so we have communication contact template. So who's the important people that need to be on that list, such as the state veterinarian, state animal health official, the public health official in the case of any other zoonotic disease concerns. So obviously I couldn't do this alone. I really give a lot of credit to the co-authors, which is Josie Traub-Doggett, Ellen Mary Wilson, and Dr. Madigan out of the UC Davis, and my boss who said yes to the idea in the first place, Dr. Fowler. And then obviously the equine EMMP is usually what I say, so I get stumbled. Equine Medication Monitoring Program Advisory Committee, because they're really the ones, the industry that asked for this and wanted this. So again, I really thank them for all their time, because they kept coming in saying, well, we like this, but we want this. But I think in the end, we have a really good toolkit.